I feel like maybe it was this one. But I feel like, yeah, this one people were kind of like torn about. But yeah, I feel like just in your practice, if you find yourself like stuck between 50-50, really look at like the words and like what do they mean. Um, okay, so let's see. Okay, yeah, choosing answers just because they're mentioned in the passage. So I feel like a lot of times there'll be these like trap answers that is mentioned somewhere, but it's like not relevant to the question. So it's always good to make sure that like, just because you found something that's like somewhat like it's loosely like, for example, if they're asking about like this specific um like maybe it was like this specific person's opinion about something, right? And you maybe found like an opinion about that thing in general, but it wasn't what specifically the question wanted, like that person, so make sure that um what you found is actually like answering the question and actually like relevant to it. um yeah, this 8 is kind of touching on what I was saying earlier, right? Kind of putting your own opinions or assumptions, um and then just vibes. I guess this is not, like you're not really thinking. Um, Again, everything should be intentional, right? I like to use the word kind of mindful. You should be mindful about like what are you doing and like, yeah. And then, like I said earlier, the growth mindset. Like this MCAT is hard, right? And I feel like this is the same kind of attitude I'd imagine you'd need to have in medical school too, and just being a doctor. Like you're gonna face things that maybe you don't know or just difficult, and that you have to be like, okay, like don't get thrown off, and like, okay, well, like what can I do? What do I know? Right? Okay. And yeah, people have questions while I'm talking. Like, feel free to just like, I have the chat open, so I'm paying attention to that. So I think I'm not going to get too much into. I'm not going to go over this whole thing. I do think like, um, actually, I can briefly kind of go over these, but generally, yeah, there are. The questions are kind of split into 3 areas: foundations of comprehension, RWT, RBT. At least for me, I think RBT, and I kind of feel like this is um, probably the same for most people, but RBT was a bit difficult for me. At least some of the questions that I was getting wrong sometimes were RBT, or I think I would like didn't. For the other ones, like I don't know, got lazy with looking for stuff or whatever. But I think like you don't get too hooked up like, oh, I need to know like which question this is, because a lot of times like if you just it's like you don't if you're just thinking about what the question wants, assigning it like doesn't necessarily help you, but I feel like, yeah, RBT I feel like throws people because they introduce like new information, and then the answers usually they give, it's like, oh, this had nothing to do with the passage because they put like a whole new situation, an example that I think of is there's a passage about like gossip or something, which is like passed verbally, right? And then all the answer choices were like, one thing was like, I don't know, like a look, or another thing was, I don't know, they were just like nonverbal things, right? Um, yeah, okay. So yeah, I kind of put here my recommended approach. I kind of break it down into like the passage, the question, and the answer choices. So yeah, for reading the passage, like I was saying earlier, you don't want to spend too long. Like unless you have a photographic memory or something, which I feel like most people don't, it's like you're not going to remember the passage like in its entirety, right? So you just need to kind of, at least for me, what I suggest is reading enough to have like a general idea, and then use your highlights to help you reference back, right? And also highlight like the main points. And this is also something which I feel like at least I've started doing, like I said, with like the amino acids and proteins. I'm like, oh, they're talking about a protein, like they mentioned like it's a monomer, like I highlight this, I know they're going to ask about it. Okay, and then yeah, analyzing the question. So I put there like rephrase the question in your own words. What I kind of mean is just like simplify it, right? Don't just like kind of at its core, like, what do they want, right? And then generally recommend, don't look at the answers yet. Figure out what passage information do you need to answer the question. Then go find that, simplify that information, and now bring this information to the answer choices, and then ask yourself, like, does A match this information? Yes or no, right? If you're not sure, like, don't cross it off, just like look at the next one, right? Generally, you can eliminate some answer choices. Again, the ones that are like the opposite of what you found or like completely irrelevant, right? I think this approach can save a lot of time, that you're not overthinking every single answer choice, and that it's just easier, like, does this match, right? Yes or no. And I recommend like asking yourself questions about the passage information and about the answer choices, like simple yes or no questions that are easy for you to kind of like refute. Okay, so I think this was my example. So yeah, if there are still no more questions, I'm gonna jump into the passage, which I think you all should be able to see. Oh, is my stream still going? I think I closed. Okay, it still seems to be good. Oh, I see typing. Also, I think people can talk, right? So if you have like a question, you just want to like chime in, like that's fine too. If you'd rather like say it than have to type it. Do I answer each question? Okay, so I don't I actually was recently working with somebody and they were asking me like, okay, so am I like what's the word? They asked whether I'm like predicting the answer. And I'm like, I don't like to say that I'm predicting, right? Because I'm trying not to like put my own. Okay, obviously when you're interpreting, like, yes, like some of your opinion is in there, but I don't, it's not like I know what the answer is and I'm just like, okay, like this, I found this thing, right? Which of these things match that? And so that's kind of what that's how I do it, if that makes sense. And the reason why I don't like saying like, oh, I'm predicting or I'm answering it is because I just feel like that kind of thing is more likely to lead you to like misinterpret and like rely too much on your opinion. And I try to stay like objective, you know? Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I'm referencing the evidence, right? And I was telling somebody, kind of like, just imagine you're bringing the passage information to the answer choice and just like apples to oranges or apples to apples, right? Like, are these two things the same? Like, yes or no, right? And then generally, like, I feel like the majority of the questions, unless it's like RBT, they're kind of more straightforward. And so the answer should pretty much like match the passage information, right? You will find one that is like, yes, this matches, and like pick it and move on, right? For the ones that are more difficult, they're like, oh, which of these, it's like the 1, 2, and 3, and like the answers are different combinations. Like that's going to be different. RBT will be different, but I think for like the general CMP and some of the RWT, this approach kind of like simplifies it. But yeah, just make sure you just you don't want to be putting like too much of your opinion, and just be open to what the answer could be. And I guess that's why also I don't like saying like, oh, I'm predicting or I'm answering it, because I feel like it kind of narrows your view. And so, for example, if I did find passage information, I brought it to the answer choices, none of them matched, right? Then I'm like, okay, kind of like need to reassess, right? So maybe like, did I overlook something in the question, right? Um, yeah, okay. If that makes sense, I'm gonna continue. So yeah, is the size of the screen share the passage good? Or do I need to zoom in? It's good? Okay. Okay, so yeah, like I was saying, you don't want to spend too long reading the passage. Have in the past like asked other people who are scoring like 130 up kind of how long they took. Again, this was not like a proper survey or anything, but just from the few people who did reply, they seemed to kind of speed through it. And so I'm talking like 3 to 4 minutes. I think somebody, I forget who it was, but I think they were crazy, just like 2 minutes. But yeah, don't spend too long. I personally recommend, like I've said, going back and finding the passage information. Somebody was telling me that they saw some course or some guide that was saying like don't do that. I just think most people don't have like super great like short-term memory like that. Okay, so let's get started. And for people who have, if there are any new people who have joined, I am going over a passage right now, just because nobody has any specific questions. But if you do have a question, you can either like unmute yourself and ask, or type it in the chat. And T is recording this, and probably will post it later, so you can watch the beginning if you missed it. But I just kind of went over my general approach. Okay, so yeah, like I was saying, I like to use highlighting to kind of help just like pick stuff out, right? When you are going back and looking for the passage information, like use your highlights to kind of guide you and kind of like refresh your memory, right? Okay. So I think for the sake of just like showing you, I'll kind of like talk through these. But generally I like don't speak out loud to myself. I silently read it. But okay, so I also recommend reading. I don't know if there's a proper term for this, but like don't read a whole sentence straight. Like some of these sentences are really long. And again, kind of short-term memory thing, right? You're gonna read the whole thing and you're just like reading it and not actually thinking about it. So I kind of like to, I call it like chunking, just kind of read in like phrases, right? Okay. So in the, whatever this is, chapel of this church, okay, there are these two people and they painted frescoes of two important biblical events, right? So this kind of sets us off that we're talking about like these guys, right? We're talking about these two and that like these two important biblical events. Actually, I just remember something I want to talk about before I read the rest of it. Pretty much all the CARS passages are going to like introduce some idea, and then they're going to like what will follow the idea or the point is going to be like an explanation or example. And if you're kind of like get lost, like rephrase things like this way, like, okay, here's the point, right? Here's this explanation of that. Here's this example. And I think this is also great that if you like see a sentence that you're like, okay, I don't quite understand, but like more likely than not, an example is going to follow that kind of like clarifies. Okay. So what about these paintings, right? So these scenes representing respectively the temptation and the expulsion of Adam and Eve. So okay, they act as a visual and thematic overture to the cycle. So together they represent the fall of man. Okay. I also want to say like there's not necessarily like one right or wrong way to highlight. I know like I kind of talked about what I suggested, but if you were doing this passage and you didn't highlight exactly these, like that's fine. Okay. In both images, Adam and Eve are rendered full length and in proximity to one another. So they're just kind of describing what the painting looks like. Executed by Masolino and Masaccio, the two images epitomize a stylistic contrast between the slender elegance of Gothic figures and the new pathos of Renaissance bodies. Okay, so the only thing I'm focusing on is there's this contrast, right? We're contrasting this to this, right? If you want, I feel like maybe they'll ask us about this, right? Okay, and the main point is we're contrasting. And so what do they say? The contrast is all the more significant when one considers that the two images are not discrete portions of a larger narrative of Genesis. They form a two-part visualization of the fall. So yeah, they're just making a point, right? That is significant. It's not this discrete kind of like separate, small, whatever thing, this larger narrative, their visualization. Okay, the main point is, right, we're talking about these painters and their works, though. Okay, the introduction of sexuality inaugurates the need to conceal. Okay, so this is being introduced, and it's bringing, right, the need to conceal. And before finding leaves to provide primitive clothing, Adam and Eve employ their arms and hands for that purpose, okay? So we have this thing being introduced, right? We have the need to conceal. They are not covering themselves with leaves. They're covering themselves with their arms. Okay. Neither the portions of the body to be covered nor the mechanics of their concealment are accorded any textual specification. And, more importantly, within the text, the impulse to screen the body is not differentiated along gender lines. I think at this point, like, kind of what I pick out from this is that, right, that there's this no differentiation along gender lines. But the whole thing we're talking about like them covering themselves, right, and kind of the way they're being portrayed. Okay, consequently, artists tended to visualize the fall. Okay, so here we're talking about other people, right? They tended to visualize the fall in such a way that Adam and Eve share one and the same gesture. So generally, they show them they're doing the same thing, right? Same gesture. Right hand covers the groin, the left arm hides the breast. Okay, so we know that they're kind of showing the same thing. Okay, so now we're talking about specifically this other guy's Eve, right? So it seems that there's going to be some kind of like comparing and contrasting. Okay, so his Eve echoes this pose in the activity of the torso. So the torso is the same, but what's different? Pathetic upward gaze and the contracted motion. Okay, so there's some differences here, and that these are original features, right? So it's not kind of the same what they had introduced earlier. Okay, so now we're talking about this guy's Adam. Okay, what does he do? He alters the model entirely. So this guy's Adam is totally different. As he advances parallel to Eve, Adam employs his hands to cover his eyes. Okay, so instead of covering his he's covering his eyes instead of covering his like genitalia, instead of hiding his body. And then, okay, so here's a new guy we're introducing. This guy says what? Adam and Eve's gestures, they find individual explanation in contemporary physiognomics, okay? And now he's kind of explaining, what does this mean? After the fall, Eve's pressing her breast with the palm of her hand. Okay, this is grief, right? This gesture is grief. And then what? Adam's covering his eyes is a sign of shame. And I think at this point, kind of simplifying things, we're just talking about this artist and the way he's portraying Adam and Eve. Okay, the two sentiments visualized by this guy, okay, grief and shame, which we talked about earlier, only partially coincide with the sentiments mentioned in the biblical text, shame and fear. So it's only slightly aligns with it. Lack of concordance between image and text was a deliberate choice on his part. For further scrutiny, what? Reveals that Adam and Eve's gestures are not only different, but in one important respect complementary. Adam screens his eyes. So now we're getting into kind of an explanation. He prevents himself from seeing. So Adam, he prevents himself from seeing, from being the agent of vision. Eve, conversely, covers her pubic area. Hers is a concern with being seen, as she feels herself to be the object of vision. And so Eve, she doesn't want to be seen. Concerned with being seen. Man prevents himself from seeing. Woman presents herself from being seen. Relationship, the genders have to vision are the result of the fall. Women experience melancholy and men shame. So just kind of expanding on what we were saying earlier. Okay, the last paragraph. The complementary contrast between seeing and being seen has now to be checked at the preceding stage. Okay, so we're talking about preceding stage before the transgression, at the time of innocence. So now we're talking about the other person. So the temptation, we see things are different. While Adam is gazing at Eve, she feels no need either to reciprocate or to obstruct man's gaze. Before the fall, Adam gazes uninhibitedly at Eve, and the focus as well as the quality of his attention is such that Eve can, in fact, sustain his gaze without comfort. So before, she didn't want to be seen, and like now she's fine, right? She doesn't care. She can sustain his gaze without comfort. I'm just kind of contrasting after the fall. It is only with the fall, so with the fall, that woman becomes conscious of being the object of the gaze, and her anxiety at being an object of vision is accompanied by Adam's reluctance to be its agent. As Eve is despondent, Adam is burdened by embarrassment. So, my kind of takeaway, right, from this whole thing, from the first pass, is that we're talking about these guys and their paintings, right? The fall or the expulsion of Adam and Eve, then the temptation. We're talking about how kind of interpreting the way that Adam and Eve are represented, specifically like the way their like body language is, and also like what it means, right? The way that they're being portrayed, and then also comparing this to kind of before, or contrasting this with before. Does anybody have questions about kind of reading the passage or anything? Okay. Okay, so questions, right? So like I was saying earlier, I kind of view this as like, what is the question asking? What information do we need? And like, what does the passage say? So, question one: which of the following is least likely to be seen in a typical painting of Adam, Eve, in the fall? So right off the bat, I like to highlight words like least or whatever, just to make sure you're not getting like getting it twisted later, because that's definitely happened to me where like I wasn't paying attention that it said like the least or most or whatever, and that might be like they're gonna have trap answers. Okay, so they're asking us, right, a painting of Adam Eve in the fall, what is like not what are we not going to see, right? So generally with this kind of question, the passage is going to tell us like what is in there, right? So we need to know like what is the typical like representation of Adam Eve in the fall. So we need to go and see um, where in the passage it says that. Does anybody remember or have any ideas? Okay, Matthew says paragraph 2. So what does it say in paragraph 2 about the typical representation of Adam Eve in the fall? Right? So um they would cover themselves with their hands, right? So right here, right, inaugurates the need to conceal, and before finding leaves to provide primitive clothing, they use their arms and hands for that purpose, right? They're naked and they're covering with their hands, right? So this is how kind of they're represented, right? Covering themselves, shameful. So least likely is going to be like not this, right? And we could already go ahead then and eliminate which answer choices. If we want something that wouldn't be seen in the painting, based on the passage, we could eliminate. Okay, so somebody says A and B. So how come A and B? Yeah, so that the paintings that those are happening in the paintings, right? The passage tells us they are doing that, therefore that would not be least likely to be seen, right? Yeah. So these are going kind of like opposite based on passage information, right? We know this is most likely to be seen, therefore A and B are wrong, right? Okay, what about C and D? What are our thoughts right now? It's a nude image, so naked Eve or Adam wearing a leaf. Okay, yeah. So Matthew said that it's implied they're naked, right? Okay. So if the passage says they're naked, is it likely or not likely to see Eve naked? So it's likely, right? It's likely she's going to be naked. Therefore, right, it can't be C. And kind of, yeah, I mean, this is one way process of elimination. We should also double check, right? So what does the passage say about, like, why would we not see Adam wearing a leaf? Right, yeah. In paragraph 2, it says explicitly right here, right, before finding leaves, right? So they were not portrayed with like wearing leaves or anything. Okay, and yeah, D is the correct answer here. Okay. The second question, which of the following relationships is most like the suggested relationship of Adam to Eve post fall in the last paragraph of the passage? So, a few things I would want to kind of point out from the question, right? One is we need like most like, right? Most like this. And what? Adam and Eve, but specifically post fall, okay? Post fall Adam and Eve. And then they also tell us where. Last paragraph, okay? If the question tells you a specific paragraph, do not look elsewhere. They might have answer choices that relate to different parts of the passage. That will not be the answer, okay? So this is kind of touching on like just because it's mentioned, right, doesn't mean it's the answer. Okay, so this is like looking here, right? We can see like photographer, sculptor, mother, baseball. These are like situations not talked about, right? This is an RBT question. So what we need to do is, right, we're going to figure out what do they want, okay? So we need to know what's Adam and Eve's relationship post fall, okay? According to this last paragraph. So we need to go and see in the last paragraph, well, what was their relationship like, right? Okay. So let's look here at the last paragraph. Can anybody see any mention of Adam and Eve's relationship specifically post fall? Okay, right. Yeah, Eve becomes self-conscious. So we see here, right, they mentioned before the fall, right? He looks at her this way, and then with the fall, right, woman becomes conscious of being the object of the gaze. And her anxiety at being the object of vision is accompanied by his reluctance to be its agent, right? Like Matthew said, she becomes self-conscious. He doesn't want to look at her. He's embarrassed. She's depressed, right? Okay, so we're looking for a situation where somebody would be, we're kind of replacing them, right? Where one person doesn't want to be looking at the other, right? They don't want to be. One person feels really sad and the other person is like embarrassed or whatever, right? So we need to go into these answer choices and ask ourselves, is that relationship present, right? So for example, A, photographer and model, right? Would the photographer and model, would they have this relationship where one of them is like they knows they're being watched, they the other person doesn't want to watch them, and that like one's depressed and like embarrassed and stuff. Okay. So T thinks it's C. Okay. So why do you guys think it's C? Okay. The passage does say embarrassment right here. Exactly. Yes. Another way I think is also like exactly. Yeah, Nicola, great. Yeah, C is the only answer that has a negative connotation. Yes, and like Judge said, is the odd man out. Yeah, they are. The other ones are more positive, right? I think A is like neutral. B and D are like positive, right? And then C is not. Okay, great. Yes, the answer is C. Good job. Okay, question 3. Which of the author's assertions is most susceptible to empirical verification or refutation? So, okay, most susceptible. Okay, so pretty much this wants to know like which one of these can we fact check, right? Which of these things can be fact checked? Okay, so in this case, we don't go look in the passage information, right? They're asking us to look at each answer and say like, can we prove this? Okay, is there a way of like testing it or whatever, right? Okay. So A is the fall depicts a dramatic change in the state of humanity. B, they painted two important biblical events. C, the covered eyes suggests that Adam's guilty, and then in the temptation, Eve is comfortable with Adam's gaze, right? I would say generally, if we're looking for like the most, the ones that are like would could not be, if we could not verify this, those are ones we should eliminate. Are there any that stand out that like these are not like actually like you cannot actually like verify this? So they want to know which one can be verified. I think the whole empirical verification that is not necessary. Oh, is the green bee supposed to mean something? Oh, the B answer choice. Okay. Um. So I feel like if something is, unless we're talking about subjective differently, um, if it's kind of subjective, like people are can kind of have like different interpretations of it. Um, but yeah, in this case, like which ones can we like prove is that essentially, right? Um, and that so Nicola, you think B. So what's your thoughts with B? Yeah, I think looking at D, right? Is there any way to like prove that she was comfortable? The passage is saying that she was, but is there any way to prove that? B is easier to dispute. Because how could we like check B? Well, I feel like in this case, right, we could literally go and like, are these biblical events, right? Are they? Like, yes or no, right? We can't, when C and D are both asking about like what do they think, right? Is there any way that we could know for sure what Adam, like the guy drew Adam to show he was guilty, or how Eve actually felt, right? Is there any way that to like know for sure how somebody was like feeling, or um like their intention or whatever? Okay, so Matthew thinks it's C. Are there any ones that you guys think we can eliminate? Okay, so what do you think about A? So one thing that kind of throws me about A is that like the state of humanity. Because again, this is just from like short-term memory of going through the passage. That part kind of like throws me off, right? Um. So in this case, the correct answer. Oh, before I say, is there any more comments? So remember, they're not asking whether we can prove it from the passage. So all we know is A, B, C, A, all of these answer choices, the author made these assertions, right? Or whatever. Like, but that like, how can we prove them? I would say yeah, T, that it does make A harder, like what dramatic, like what standards by who, right? Like how do could people have different answers, right? Could there be different interpretations? Like kind of think of the answer choices that way. Are there any answer choices that is like could not is not like black and white? The answer is not black and white. Okay, so the question is asking which of the author's assertions is most susceptible to empirical verification, right? I would say like which one can we verify? Which one can be proven or disproven? But I would say like the verification, right? Like which one that we like could for sure be like this is true or this isn't true. Again, it's not based on like yes. What 8 Bix is saying, yes. Using facts or numerical values. Like it has to be a fact. And like I was saying earlier, people's feelings are not facts. Like these painters are not alive anymore, right? How do we know like that he meant to make him look guilty? Right? And then D, how do we know? Like we can't ask Eve, right? I mean, even still people's feelings can change. Maybe like in the moment you thought you felt one way and then later like you did realize you didn't, right? Feelings aren't facts. So it's not asking you based on the passage. The question doesn't ask based on the passage. Okay, so this one is actually B. So the answer is B. So we need to like prove it. And there's no way to prove that like the author's feelings, right? Or how Eve felt. It pretty much like which of these things can be measured, right? I do think the wording, especially like this part, right? Because you think of like refuting, like proving it wrong, right? But I think that's why I kind of viewed it as like fact check. Also, this is like a third party material, so like take that with a grain of salt. Um, but I think that like I kind of took it like, okay, which one of these can be verified, right? These are like people's opinions or feelings. We can't ask them, you know? And we could see like, okay, are these things in the Bible? Like yes or no, you know? Um, well, we can do the Picasso passage. Yeah. Um, okay. I think there are three more questions for the people who are helping me host. Do you guys need, because technically, I don't know if we said like how long it's going. I have time to do the last few. Um, so if that's fine. If people still want to stick around, if people want me to finish it, we can finish them. If not, we can kind of just do like, if people have questions, I can answer them and we can call it a night. Thanks people for being flexible. I'm on the West Coast time. So, and I work during the day. So, um, yeah, I know for other people on the East Coast, it's a little bit late. Okay, sure, let's finish. Okay, great. Um, okay, question 4. The discussion of the sentiments visualized by this guy best supports the passive assertion that what, right? And they're going to give us some assertions, okay? So what are we talking about, right? The discussion of the sentiments, right? This guy specifically. And then we want us supporting, okay? So we need to know, right? Um, so this guy, the discussion is supporting what point, right? Well, we need to know, okay, well, what was the discussion, right? And how was it used in the passage? Okay, so can anybody tell me where do they talk about the sentiments visualized by Masaccio or Masaccio? Okay, Matthew says paragraph 4. I agree, right? We started off with two sentiments, right? Two sentiments. Okay, so what does he talk about in the paragraph? What's the purpose? What's the discussion about? Any thoughts? I'll give another minute. Okay, we got PS chiming in. Okay. So we're talking about their behaviors, right? We're talking about they're related, right? What specifically did they say about their behaviors? How did the behaviors relate to the sentiments? Okay, so Matthew says behaviors were influenced by the fall. Okay, so what throws you about A? Or I guess actually before you don't send your message yet, because I want to talk a little bit more about what it's saying, right? So they say that, right? Adam and Eve, we're talking about the behaviors in the fall and how like grief and shame, right? They say that it doesn't totally coincide with what the Bible says. Shame and fear, and that this was done on purpose, right? And that, right, it says that they're complementary. Adam is doing one thing because he doesn't want to be seen, right? Adam doesn't want to be seen, or sorry, he doesn't want to see, and then Eve doesn't want to be Eve doesn't want to be seen. And that, right, as a result, women feel this way and men feel that way, right? So, um, okay, so knowing that, right, we're then asked, this is going to support a point. This information needs to support a point, okay? They're going to give us these points, and we need to, if there are any that like have nothing to do with what like we're talking about here, we can eliminate that, right? And so let's think of it that way, right? So do any answer choices stand out as being like this either doesn't support that or like has nothing to do with that? I think like was the author trying to make the point in answer A, B, C, and D like that, right? Like if we think A, right? Was the point is this supporting like oh they paint them in the same way, right? Yeah, in this case it's a best support one, right? So we need to know which one is like it's closest to. And I like to kind of rephrase these this way, right? If I were to say A, like for example, point A, right? Oh, Adam and Eve, like people paint them the same way, right? And then if you come up with like, well, Adam covers his eyes because feels shame, and like Eve covers her body because she's whatever sad. Like, does that have I supported the original point? Okay, Matthew's saying, yeah, they're unhappy for different reasons, right? Answer choice B. Apix says not A. Um, they're complementary, right there, and that I think one thing is that like, how did Masaccio or whatever? How did he represent Adam and Eve in like he painted them differently, right? He showed them differently. So would this support like, oh, people generally paint them the same? Right? I would say no. That them being painted differently doesn't support them being painted the same, right? And yeah, in this case, the correct answer is B. Right? They are unhappy for two different reasons. I think, thinking about D, central to two important events, they say here that it only partially coincides, right? If this paragraph saying it only partially coincides with the Bible, saying it wouldn't support like, oh, they're central to the Bible, right? So we can say not D. Um, and then the point of this how do I strike through? The point of this, I don't know why it's not letting me strike through, but right, the point of this that they're doing different things, expressing their feelings, right? It's not supporting like, okay, they're using their hands to cover their bodies, right? Yeah. So, B. Okay. Question 5. The author explains that Masaccio's painting of Adam and Eve is different from those of most painters because he what, right? So what's the question asking? Okay. This guy's painting is different. Okay. Because why, right? So we need to know why was his depiction of Adam and Eve different from other painters? Okay. So we need to see where do they talk about this guy's paintings and why it's different, right? And Matthew has said paragraph 3. Let's look there. Okay. So we first mention is this guy's Eve. Okay, and I think this is kind of the first mention of like his painting specifically. Right. He alters Adam, okay. He alters Eve a little bit, but it says mostly he echoes it, right? Eve's mostly similar, some differences. Adam is completely changed, right? Adam's now not covering his genitalia, he's covering his eyes. Okay, so how is it different? So it's different from most of those painters because he what? Depicts Eve as comfortable with Adam's gaze. Departs from the sentiments in the biblical episode, gives Adam and Eve different gestures, paints Adam covering his groin and chest, right? So like I was saying, it's easiest to eliminate answers that have like either go against what the passage said or like nothing, like not related at all. Or if you see an answer choice that exactly matches what the passage said, right? So, Matthew was saying he altered Adam, right? Eve's a little bit different. Adam is altered. Do we see any answer choices that kind of are aligned with that? So I would say, in terms of eliminating answers, right? The whole that they were different. How? So Adam is covering his eyes, okay, and Eve has this pathetic upward gaze, right, and then contracted motion of body, okay. Um, does he depict Eve as comfortable with Adam's gaze? We don't even talk about Adam and them like looking at each other, right? Like they're not looking at each other. This is mentioned later here, right? Which is not what we're talking about, like this specific depiction. Departs from the sentiments in the biblical episode. Okay, do they say that? Is that why it's different? I would say they don't really mention like biblical stuff here. Gives Adam and Eve different gestures. Okay. So what did it say, right? Eve, her body is upward gaze. Adam, he's covering himself differently, right? I would say that this does seem like different gestures. Like, yeah, that's not wrong, right? Paints Adam covering his groin and chest, okay? Okay, oh yeah, George says Eve is the one covering, right? It says Eve, am I looking at the right one? Yeah. That Adam, what is he doing? He's covering his eyes, right? Adam, this is wrong. He's not covering his groin and chest, right? And in this case, the correct answer is C. Okay, the last question. Which view expressed by the author is most important for readers to share if they're to be convinced of the merits of the passage argument? Okay, so they're going to give us these views, these authors' views, right? And we need to know which of these are going to be most relevant, right? Most important if we need to be convinced of the merits, okay? So we can think of like the most important thing to be convinced, the most important thing to believe, something like that, right? Okay. So the whole point of the passage, right, was these painters, the way they're depicting Adam and Eve, and the way kind of how that, like, the way they're depicted, like, what's that translating to, right? Shame, embarrassment, whatever, stuff like that, right? And contrasting before the fall and after. Okay, so if we're to believe that this argument is, like, correct, true, which of these things do we need to believe? What must be true? So we could think of it this way: which of these things must be true if this thing is right? Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of votes for D. Okay, so why are people thinking D? Okay, so yeah, T cell saying, right, this is kind of the thesis of the passage, right? The whole thing's talking about like their gestures, yeah, right? The way that their gestures and what those things mean, right? How through the gestures we can see like what they feel. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, exactly. The correct answer is D, right? Okay, great job. Um, so are there any questions or anything? I'm gonna stop my screen. Whether there are questions about the passage we did or questions, I can always open that back up, or if there are questions about kind of cars in general. You can also like unmute yourself and speak too if you'd rather do that rather than type. Okay, so practicing, I don't think so I've had some people ask me like, okay, about the like logging mistakes, should you create like this extravagant Excel sheet? I don't think logging, like tracking stuff for the sake of tracking is helpful. It depends on like what are you doing with it, right? The way to get better in any of the sections is to identify like either content gaps or maybe mistakes you're making, right? So the first thing is kind of figuring out like why did you get it wrong, right? But also like how can you not get it wrong again, you know? So actually when I was doing I did do these before we met, and the one whatever one was that like about the post fall. I actually got that one wrong because I totally missed that it said post fall, right? And so like that's what I was kind of saying earlier, that you have to make sure kind of like not getting sloppy and like following through with stuff. And so, like, okay, making sure that you're noting, is this most or least or whatever, Um, and so, yeah, I don't want to say there's not necessarily like a right number of like passages to do. It's again about the quality of your practice, So, um, I recommend probably doing one passage, right? Review that, and see like, okay, did you like what like mistake have you been making? Generally, like people are creatures of habit. You're gonna be kind of like, everybody kind of has like the ways they think, right? So figure out um what may be like mental like pathways or patterns you have that are leading you to um kind of getting questions wrong, right? Whether you weren't paying super attention, I think like again, this is applicable to the other sections too. Like I was mentioning earlier about the amino acids, I got a question wrong because it was like, oh, which bonds like wouldn't be affected or something like that, and it was about like, oh, it was a monomer, not a multimer, so it wouldn't have like a quaternary structure, right? So now I'm like, oh, okay, if they're talking about proteins, they're going to tell me like monomer, whatever. They're going to tell me that. And next time I need to highlight that, you know? I think in cars, no matter the topic, the general like principles are the same, you know? And just make sure that you are not like kind of putting your opinion, looking in the wrong places. So I think if you're beginning, starting out, do a passage, right? And kind of figure out like, is it, did you like go look at the wrong place? Did you misinterpret the question? Like some things like that. But yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily like logging mistakes is like gonna guarantee you get better, you know? You could make like a little like sticky note or something. That's just like, okay, like I did this thing, you know, like I put my own opinion in, right? Whatever. Something like that. You're also welcome to like post questions in the cars channel, and you can tag me directly if you want, and I'll get to them when I can. But I feel like for some people it can be hard to kind of identify uh, maybe like trends you're making. So yeah, I'm willing to like take a look if you need help. Any other questions? Yeah, thank you. Everybody. Yeah, I think we're good to stop recording. Thanks everybody who helped host this and everybody else for attending.